Welcome to Imperial History, the podcast where we explore the epic stories of empires that shaped the world, from their triumphant rises to their dramatic falls. I'm your host, Eric Alexander. The Byzantine-Sasanian War did not just happen. It erupted, like a volcano that had been rumbling for years, an inevitable explosion of political chaos, personal vendettas, and imperial ambition. It was a clash of titans, the kind of monumental struggle that reshaped the ancient world, leaving ripples that would reverberate across centuries. To understand how we got here, let us rewind the clock to the year 602, one of those years where everything that could go wrong did. The Byzantine Emperor Maurice, a man who had spent his reign juggling fragile alliances, an unruly military, and the ever-present spectre of internal dissent, saw it all come crashing down. The coup that toppled him was not just violent, it was barbaric. Phocas, the man who seized power, made sure to leave no doubt about his intentions. Maurice and his family were butchered in a public spectacle so gruesome, so appalling, that it horrified not only the Byzantine populace, but anyone who heard of it. One of those people was Khosrow II, the Shahanshah of Persia. This was not just a political inconvenience for him, it was deeply personal. Maurice was not just an ally to Khosrow, he was a benefactor, a mentor, almost a father figure. Years earlier, Maurice had helped Khosrow stabilize his throne during a messy civil war, essentially saving his life. And now, that same Maurice had been hacked to pieces by a man who dared to call himself emperor. For Khosrow, this was more than an outrage. It was a pretext, a rallying cry, and perhaps a golden opportunity. But let us not kid ourselves. Khosrow was not just some grieving protege out for revenge. Oh no, he was a cunning strategist, a master of power politics. Avenging Maurice gave him the perfect excuse to go to war, but beneath the surface his motives were layered, calculated, and unmistakably self-serving. He saw an empire, the Byzantine Empire, teetering on the edge of chaos. Phocas was not just despised, he was utterly incompetent, a walking disaster in imperial robes. Khosrow saw a chance to expand Persian influence, to exploit Byzantine instability, and to carve out a greater slice of the ancient world for his own glory. And so, war erupted. But like so many conflicts that start with a clear purpose, this one quickly spiraled into something much bigger, much messier. Khosrow's campaign was not just about revenge or opportunism. It became a protracted struggle for dominance, a war that sucked both empires into a vortex of destruction they could barely control. This was not just another war. It was the war, a war that would bleed the Byzantine and Sasanian empires dry, pushing them to their limits and beyond. It was the twilight of an era, a conflict so devastating that it would leave both powers vulnerable to a new force rising from the deserts to the south. But we will get to that. For now, picture the world on the brink, two ancient superpowers locked in a death match, their leaders driven by vengeance, ambition, and fear. The war they unleashed would stretch across decades, consuming armies, cities, and entire generations. By the time the dust settled, the world would look very different, a world that neither Maurice nor Phocas nor Khosrow could have imagined. The early reign of Phocas was like watching a ship captain abandon the wheel in the middle of a brewing storm. Instead of preparing for the waves crashing on the horizon, he turned his attention inward, consolidating power, rooting out rivals, and brutally crushing dissent. The Byzantine court in Constantinople seemed paralyzed, wrapped up in palace intrigue and internal purges, oblivious or willfully blind to the growing threat on the empire's borders. But that threat was real. The murder of Maurice had not just destabilized the imperial throne, it had sent shockwaves rippling through the eastern frontier. The delicate balance along the Byzantine-Persian border, a balance forged through decades of uneasy diplomacy, was now in shambles. Yet inside Constantinople's gilded halls, many dismissed the idea of a Persian invasion. After all, had not Khosrow II relied on Byzantine support to secure his throne during Persia's own internal strife? Why would he bite the hand that had once fed him? This complacency, this profound underestimation of Khosrow, would prove catastrophic, because Khosrow was not just some grateful client king. He was a tactician, a schemer, a man who knew how to seize the moment. From the start, he weaponized Byzantine instability, finding an unlikely ally in Narses, a former general of Maurice's army. Narses had refused to acknowledge Phocas as emperor, viewing him not as a legitimate ruler, but as a usurper drenched in the blood of his predecessor. Fleeing to Persia, Narses brought with him not only his military expertise, but also an enigmatic figure, a man who claimed to be Theodosius, the son of the slain Maurice. Now, whether this man was truly Theodosius or some carefully crafted impostor from Khosrow's court is a question that historians still debate. But in the grand scheme of things, it did not really matter. What mattered was his symbolic value. To the world, he was not just a man, he was a banner, a rallying cry for everyone still loyal to Maurice or disillusioned by the chaos of Phocas's rule. Khosrow played this card masterfully. In a grand ceremony held in the Persian capital of Ctesiphon, he crowned Theodosius as the rightful emperor of the Byzantine Empire. The event was drenched in theatricality, complete with the Nestorian patriarch Sabrysho I officiating the coronation. It was not just a coronation, it was a declaration of war, wrapped in the trappings of legitimacy. With Theodosius by his side, Khosrow framed his invasion not as a campaign of conquest, but as a noble mission to avenge Maurice's murder and restore justice by placing the rightful emperor back on the Byzantine throne. This was not just clever, it was devastatingly effective. Theodosius travelled with the Persian armies, calling on Byzantine garrisons in Armenia to surrender and pledging to restore order to an empire spiralling into chaos. Khosrow's propaganda machine churned out letters and proclamations, urging the Byzantine provinces to rise against the usurper, Phocas. For those sick of Phocas's brutal reign, or still loyal to the memory of Maurice, the idea of returning to the old imperial line was like water in a desert. What Khosrow understood, and what Phocas fatally missed, was that wars are not just fought with swords and spears. They are fought with symbols, with narratives, with ideas. By turning Theodosius into a living embodiment of justice and continuity, Khosrow weaponized hope itself. And as his armies surged into Byzantine territory, that hope began to erode the fragile foundations of Phocas's regime. The war was not just coming, it had already begun, and the Byzantines were woefully unprepared. Khosrow's deployment of Theodosius was not just a tactical maneuver, it was psychological warfare at its finest. By propping up this supposed heir to Maurice's legacy, Khosrow turned the fractures within the Byzantine Empire into gaping chasms. Theodosius became more than a man. He became a symbol, a living, breathing accusation against Phocas, and a rallying point for those yearning for stability amid the chaos. But as clever as Khosrow's strategy was, this war was never going to be fought purely with symbols or rhetoric. Its brutality seeped into every corner of the empire, leaving scars that would endure long after the last sword was sheathed. Take, for instance, the grim fate of Narses, the Byzantine general who had fled to Khosrow's court in defiance of Phocas. At one point during the conflict, Narses returned to Constantinople, ostensibly for diplomatic talks aimed at negotiating peace. But whatever hopes he carried were crushed by Phocas's sheer brutality. Despite guarantees of safe passage, Phocas betrayed him, subjecting the general to a horrifying public execution by burning. This was no ordinary killing. It was a spectacle, an act of terror meant to send a message to friend and foe alike. But what it truly signaled was the reckless, self-destructive nature of Phocas's regime. Far from intimidating his enemies, Phocas only deepened the divisions within his empire, eroding the loyalty of his own people and emboldening Khosrow to press the attack. And press he did. The first major victory of Khosrow's campaign came with the capture of Dara, a city that was not just strategically important. It was a symbol of Byzantine pride and resilience. For years, Dara had stood as the eastern bulwark of the empire, a masterpiece of military engineering designed to withstand the worst Persia could throw at it. Its towering walls and innovative defensive systems made it one of the most formidable fortresses of the ancient world. Built to be both shield and sword, Dara protected Byzantine territories while serving as a launch pad for offensive operations into Persian lands. For the Sasanians, taking Dara was not just about territory. It was about breaking the Byzantine grip on Mesopotamia and opening a path straight to the empire's heart. The siege of Dara was a testament to the ingenuity and relentlessness of Khosrow's forces. Under the command of General Shahbaraz and other seasoned leaders, the Sasanians surrounded the city, severing its supply lines and isolating it from reinforcements. This was not just a show of brute force, it was psychological warfare on a massive scale. Every move the Persians made was designed to sap the defenders' morale. Siege engines, including massive battering rams and advanced catapults, pounded the walls day and night, while Sasanian engineers tunneled beneath the fortifications, threatening to bring them crashing down from below. Inside Dara, the Byzantine defenders fought with a courage that would have been legendary in a different context. They used every advantage the city's defenses offered, launching counterattacks from the ramparts and repelling wave after wave of assaults. But courage alone was not enough. Supplies were dwindling, reinforcements delayed by the chaos back in Constantinople, where Phocas's regime seemed more focused on consolidating power than addressing the existential threat bearing down on the empire. 9 months. That is how long the defenders of Dara held out against the relentless onslaught of Khosrow's Sasanian war machine. For 9 brutal months, they fought tooth and nail, using every resource, every inch of the city's formidable defenses to stave off the inevitable. But in the end, inevitability caught up with them. The decisive moment came when a section of Dara's walls once deemed impenetrable, finally gave way. After months of ceaseless bombardment and relentless undermining, the ancient stones crumbled, creating a breach large enough for Sasanian troops to flood through. What followed was not a clean victory. It was savage, chaotic, close-quarters combat. The fall of Dara was not just another defeat for the Byzantines, it was a catastrophe. Strategically, it blew a hole in the empire's eastern defenses, exposing the Mesopotamian plains to Persian advances and leaving the Byzantine frontier practically indefensible. Psychologically, it was even worse. Dara had been a symbol of Byzantine resilience, a fortress that stood as a testament to their ability to hold the line against their ancient rivals. Its loss sent shockwaves through the empire, shattering morale and casting doubt on their ability to maintain control over their eastern territories. And the aftermath? It was as brutal as the siege itself. The city was looted, its wealth carted off by triumphant Sasanian soldiers. Then, As if to make an example of Dara, it was razed to the ground, a smouldering ruin that now served as a stark warning to the rest of the Byzantine world. The logistical blow was immense. Without Dara, the Byzantines lost a critical hub for supplying their armies in the east, sabotaging the effectiveness of any counter-offensive into Sasanian territory. But Khosrow was not done. Flush with victory, he turned his attention to Edessa, another key city in the region. Unlike Dara, Edessa's fall was swift, almost anticlimactic. The speed with which the Sasanians seized the city underscored just how broken the Byzantine defences had become. With Edessa under Persian control, the floodgates opened. The Levant lay exposed, and Anatolia, the empire's heartland, suddenly found itself under threat. By 607, the Sasanians had pushed deep into Byzantine territory, launching raids that penetrated all the way to the Bosphorus. Think about that for a moment. Persian forces, who just years earlier had been confined to the fringes of Mesopotamia, now threatened Constantinople itself. The war, which had once been a border skirmish between two rival empires, had metastasized into an existential crisis for the Byzantines. Core territories were now battlegrounds. The Sasanians were no longer content with nibbling at the edges of Byzantine power. They were tearing into the very heart of the empire. While the Sasanians surged forward like an unstoppable tide, the Byzantine military floundered, undone by chaos within. And at the center of that chaos stood Emperor Phocas, a man whose rise to power was marked by blood and whose reign would be defined by failure. Phocas was no battlefield general, no administrative genius. He was a man woefully out of his depth, unfit to lead an empire already teetering on the edge of collapse. Phocas's mistrust of the aristocracy ran deep, and in his paranoia, he gutted the empire's leadership. Seasoned commanders and experienced officials, men who might have been able to salvage something from this mess, were replaced by cronies, relatives, and sycophants. It was loyalty, not competence, that determined a man's worth in Phocas's court. Only one of Maurice's senior commanders, a general named Priscus, survived the purge, and by 606, even he was bound to Phocas's nepotistic regime through marriage to the emperor's daughter. This was not leadership. It was cronyism on a catastrophic scale, a government run like a family business during one of the most dangerous periods in Byzantine history. Under Phocas, the Byzantine war effort unraveled. The Sasanians seized the initiative again and again, driving the Byzantines from one humiliating defeat to the next. Mesopotamia fell. Syria fell. Byzantine forces, demoralized and fragmented, crumbled before the disciplined and tactically superior Sasanian army. Desertions became commonplace as soldiers, unpaid, undersupplied, and unwilling to fight for a ruler they despised, abandoned their posts. Those who stayed faced impossible odds, overwhelmed by an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every battle. And yet, Phocas did not see the fault in his own leadership. Instead, he saw enemies everywhere, in his court, in his army, even in the streets of Constantinople. The emperor's response was swift and brutal. Paranoia fueled a series of purges so ruthless and indiscriminate that they began to resemble a reign of terror. Generals, officials, and ordinary citizens alike fell victim to the emperor's ever-growing fear. Far from stabilizing his rule, these purges only deepened the fractures within the empire, alienating the very people Phocas needed to hold the line against the Sasanians. The state's resources, already strained to the breaking point, were catastrophically mismanaged. Funds that should have gone toward the defense of the empire, toward paying soldiers, fortifying cities, or supplying armies, were squandered. Some were used for personal enrichment, others for vanity projects that showcased Phocas's grotesque self-obsession. In all of Italy, for example, the only structure built during his reign was a statue of himself. Imagine that. While soldiers starved and the frontiers burned, the emperor had the audacity to immortalize his likeness in stone. The military collapsed from neglect. Supplies ran out. Fortifications were left to rot. And as revolts erupted across the provinces, the empire found itself fighting not just the Sasanians, but its own citizens. By the time Phocas's reign ended, the Byzantines were not just losing the war, they were losing the empire itself. This was not just a failure of leadership, it was a collapse of the imperial system, a vivid demonstration of what happens when incompetence and paranoia take the reins during a time of crisis. And while the Sasanians advanced deeper into Byzantine territory, one question loomed over Constantinople. How much longer could the empire survive under Phocas? The answer was becoming painfully clear. The Byzantine Empire under Phocas was not just crumbling from external pressure, it was being torn apart from within. And at the heart of that internal fracture was a religious controversy so divisive, so deeply embedded in the empire's fabric, that it had become more than a theological dispute. It was a fault line threatening to split the empire in two. The monophysite controversy, which revolved around the nature of Christ, had simmered for centuries, but under Phocas it boiled over. On paper, the empire's official doctrine was clear, the Chalcedonian definition, which declared that Christ had two natures, one divine, one human, united in a single person. But not everyone agreed. In Egypt, in Syria, and across other parts of the empire, monophysitism, a belief in Christ's single, unified nature, was not just a theological position. It was a deeply rooted cultural and regional identity. For these provinces, monophysitism was not simply a matter of faith, it was part of what made them. And for years, they had felt like outsiders, marginalized and dismissed by the Chalcedonian elites in Constantinople. Previous emperors unleashed brutal repression against monophysite communities. Their leaders were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Their churches were stripped of recognition, their practices suppressed, and their very identities threatened. For the monophysites of Egypt and Syria, this was not just persecution, it was cultural annihilation. And the backlash, predictable yet catastrophic. Resentment in these provinces, already simmering after years of neglect by the central government, began to boil over. Phocas's policies turned religious dissenters into open malcontents, further alienating regions that were critical to the empire's survival. Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, and Syria, a vital buffer against Sasanian incursions, were no longer simply disgruntled provinces. They were becoming liabilities. This alienation would prove devastating as the war against the Sasanians ground on. Khosrow, ever the opportunist, did not need to stir rebellion. Every act of repression, every execution, every broken church drove the monophysite provinces further from Constantinople's orbit. And when the empire needed these provinces the most, needed their loyalty, their resources, their men, they were instead paralyzed by resentment, distrust, and a growing sense that they had more in common with their Persian enemies than with their Byzantine overlords. This was not just a religious crisis, it was a geopolitical disaster in the making. And as the Sasanians pressed further into Byzantine territory, exploiting every crack in the empire's armor, the monophysite controversy became one of the deepest fissures of all. This was more than a theological debate. This was a ticking time bomb, and under Phocas, it was about to explode. By 608, 6 long years into Khosrow's invasion, the Byzantine Empire reached its breaking point. The Sasanians had pushed deep into its heartlands, morale was in free fall, and Phocas's reign had devolved into a parade of paranoia, mismanagement, and repression. The empire was bleeding out, and for many it was clear that the only way to save it was to cut out the tumor at its center, the emperor himself. The spark of rebellion came from North Africa, a region whose wealth and grain were critical to the empire's survival. But the story of how this rebellion began is murky, steeped in the fog of later propaganda and legend. One tantalizing account suggests that Priscus, Phocas's own son-in-law and heir apparent, sent a letter to Carthage, urging its leaders to rise against the emperor. If true, it speaks volumes about the level of dissent even within Phocas's inner circle. Or perhaps it reveals something even darker, that Priscus, like so many others, had become a target of Phocas's growing paranoia and acted to save his own skin. Whatever the truth, the rebellion was led by Heraclius the Elder, the exarch of Africa, and his son, Heraclius the Younger. These men were not just plotting for power, they were acting out of desperation to salvage what remained of the empire. Their plan was as bold as it was audacious, a two-pronged strategy to cripple Phocas's regime. First, they would secure Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, cutting off the vital grain supply that fed Constantinople and further destabilizing the emperor's grip on power. Then, Heraclius the Younger would launch a naval assault on the imperial capital itself, aiming to depose the tyrant and seize the throne. The Egyptian campaign unfolded with stunning speed and efficiency. Heraclius the Elder's forces overwhelmed local defenders and secured the province, depriving Constantinople of its lifeline. It was a masterstroke, one that delivered not just a strategic victory, but also a crushing psychological blow to Phocas's regime. Without Egyptian grain, the emperor's ability to sustain his hold on power began to wither. Meanwhile, Heraclius the Younger took to the seas, leading a fleet in one of the most daring naval operations of the era. As his ships approached Constantinople, the city was already a powder keg. Years of mismanagement, oppressive rule, and military failures had turned the capital's elites and populace alike against Phocas. Intrigue buzzed through the city like a hive of angry wasps, and as Heraclius's fleet drew closer, many saw their chance to topple the hated emperor. When the rebel fleet reached the city's gates, it was as if the capital itself had already surrendered. There was no desperate last stand, no bloody street-to-street fighting. Instead, members of the city's elite, weary of Phocas's tyranny, opened the gates to the invaders. It was a swift and bloodless coup, sparing Constantinople the devastation of a prolonged siege. Once inside, Heraclius the Younger wasted no time. His forces stormed the imperial palace, capturing Phocas and bringing his reign to an end. The details of Phocas's downfall vary depending on the source, but all agree it was brutal. Fitting, perhaps, for a man whose rule had been marked by bloodshed and cruelty. The fall of Phocas was not just the end of a tyrant. It was the collapse of a man who had become the embodiment of power's corrosive influence. The accounts of his final moments, whether entirely factual or embroidered by later historians, carry a raw, almost Shakespearean quality. They are a window into the human cost of power, its ability to warp and consume, even as it elevates. Imagine the scene. Phocas, dragged before Heraclius, the man who would replace him. His regime, his legacy, what little there was of it, lay in ruins. Heraclius, the victor, stands poised to pass judgment, to put an exclamation point on the end of Phocas's blood-soaked reign. And then comes the exchange that would echo through the ages. Heraclius reportedly sneers, "Is this how you have ruled, wretch?" To which Phocas, defiant even in the face of death, replies, "And will you rule better?" It is a moment that drips with irony and bitter self-awareness. Phocas does not plead for his life or deny his crimes. Instead, he flips the script, challenging the very man about to end him. It is as if, in that moment, Phocas understood something about the nature of power that perhaps even Heraclius had not yet grasped. His retort was not just defensive, it was accusatory. Will you be any better than me? Can anyone truly wield power without being corrupted by it? What makes this exchange so haunting is how universal its implications are. It is easy to dismiss Phocas as a tyrant, a failure, a man unfit for the crown. But his final words suggest a deeper, more unsettling truth, that governance itself, especially when wielded unchecked, has a way of eroding the morality of those who hold it. Phocas's retort was not just a deflection of blame, it was a condemnation of the system that had elevated him. It was an indictment of power itself. The idea that power corrupts is not new, but Phocas gives it a grim, personal twist. His response suggests not just that rulers are susceptible to corruption, but that power creates corruption. It is not just the flawed individuals who seek power. It is the very nature of power that grinds down even those who start with good intentions. Phocas, in his own twisted way, seems to be justifying his misdeeds as inevitable, as part of the inherent flaws of leadership. Was this a genuine reflection of his own experience, or the bitter rationalization of a dying man? Maybe both. What is undeniable is the resonance of his words. They serve as a reminder that history is littered with leaders who started with promise but ended in failure, their ideals drowned in the compromises and brutalities of governance. And they serve as a warning to those who follow. Power does not just corrupt the corruptible, it corrupts everyone. Heraclius might have been victorious that day, but Phocas' words hung in the air like a curse. Would the new emperor truly rule better, or would he too, in time, become another cautionary tale, another name on the long list of rulers who succumbed to the dark gravity of the throne? Only time would tell. But in that moment, as Phocas met his end, the dying emperor delivered a truth as sharp as the blade that would take his life. In 610, Heraclius the Younger ascended the throne of Byzantium, the imperial diadem placed upon his head in the great city of Constantinople. News of his triumph travelled swiftly, even reaching the ears of his father, Heraclius the Elder, who lived just long enough to hear of his son's success before passing into history. The elder Heraclius had laid the foundation, but it was his son who now stood at the precipice, tasked with the impossible, saving an empire that seemed unsalvageable. For the people of Constantinople, battered by years of Phocas's ineptitude and the unrelenting advance of the Sasanian juggernaut, Heraclius's rise brought a glimmer of hope. The man who had overthrown a tyrant was hailed as a savior, his coronation a rare moment of optimism in a time when despair had become the empire's default state. Yet, as the dust settled and the chants of "Long live the emperor" faded into silence, the enormity of Heraclius's task became brutally clear. The Byzantine Empire. Heraclius inherited was not merely weakened, it was gutted. The treasury was barren, its coffers drained by mismanagement and plunder. The military, once the pride of the empire, was a hollow shell, demoralized, underfunded, and poorly equipped to face the challenges ahead. The borders were no longer boundaries, but open invitations for invasion. And the Sasanians, emboldened by years of unbroken success, continued their relentless march westward. By 610, the situation was nothing short of apocalyptic. The Persian general Shahrbaraz, a master tactician and a relentless adversary, had carved a path of destruction through Byzantine lands. The eastern provinces, the economic and cultural lifeblood of the empire, teetered on the brink of complete collapse. Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, cities that had stood as pillars of Byzantine civilization, were under imminent threat. The spectre of losing these critical regions loomed large, and with them the survival of the empire itself. Heraclius's task was not simply to rule, it was to resurrect. He had no time for the luxuries of consolidation or reform. Every moment demanded action, every decision a gamble. The Byzantine people had pinned their fragile hopes on him, but those hopes were as precarious as the empire itself, hanging by a thread over the abyss. The stakes could not have been higher. For Heraclius, there was no room for error. His reign began with fire at his feet and swords at his throat. As we close this episode, we are left with a question that hangs like a storm cloud over the horizon. Can Heraclius do it? Can the man who toppled a tyrant now save an empire that seems destined to crumble? Ahead lies a crucible of battles and decisions that will define not just his reign, but the very survival of Byzantium. The struggle for Antioch, the Levant, and Egypt is just beginning. The Sasanians loom large, their forces pressing ever closer to the walls of Constantinople itself. The Byzantine world, as it has been known for centuries, faces extinction. Heraclius stands at the crossroads of history, his resolve about to be tested in ways few rulers have ever endured. Next time, we will dive headlong into the chaos of this epic conflict. We will see whether Heraclius can summon the strength, the strategy, and the sheer audacity needed to defy the forces arrayed against him. The fate of an empire, and perhaps of an entire era, hangs in the balance,